Hello guys, my name is Gilberto Schofield Jr. and I'm the Business and the Strategy Director of Agência Lupa. Lupa is a fact-checking newswire service and the hub against misinformation based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And as you probably know right now, we are living under a government that uses pretty much misinformation as a political strategy. Well, like what's going on in other countries, for sure, like US, India, Italy, or more traditionally China, which means that since the very beginning of the new coronavirus pandemic, the government insisted that it wasn't a big problem and we should move on with our lives because the economy couldn't stop. That was the point since the very beginning. This group's narrative was death is inevitable and part of life. So let's not worry about it. Brazil had then in May this year around 10,000 deaths. Why? When a plane crashes and 250 people die is a national commotion. But when 10,000 people die from a pandemic isn't, we asked ourselves at that time, right? The numbers were kind of invisible. So we decided that we should do something to bring awareness to this issue. And it was a networking building process, if I can say so, to speak frankly, right? Our content director, Natalia Leal, called Alexios Mantzarles, the guy that fights misinformation at Google, and explained our idea, which was we want to bring awareness about COVID-19 victims through a data visualization tool. Alexios put us in touch with Simon Rogers, who is data editor at Google, and Simon asked one of the biggest data visualization project experts, Alberto Cairo, to get on board. Natalia and Alberto then got the concept of bringing the deaths closer by putting the people in the center of the pandemic and the victims around them, simulating a loss that could affect their neighbors, their communities, their friends. That's when At the Epicenter was born.
One of the main reasons that I think that the epicenter is such an important visualization and has had the success in Brazil that it had is that it has to do with a phenomenon in visualization that we call quantitative numbing. What is quantitative numbing? It means that we human beings have a very hard time understanding, wrapping our head around large numbers. If someone tells us more than 130,000 people have died in Brazil, it is very easy, more than 200,000 people have died in the United States or in other countries. It is very hard for us to put a human face to that number, right? And the scope of the problem will be impossible to grasp. It's impossible to grasp. The fact that the number is so large, so enormous, that sort of like short circuits our capacity to process that number. However, when we put that number on a human scale, when we compare that number to ourselves, or when we surround ourselves by that data, suddenly that data acquires a certain physicality, so to speak, right? And that's the power of this project, I think. It forces you to visualize this idea. What if all these people who have died were your neighbors? What about if the first person who died was the guy, the man or the woman who you see every day going to buy bread or have morning coffee or whatever in the cafeteria in the corner? What about if that was the first person who died? And then what about if the other 40 who died a few days later? What about if there were people who surround you? And then later, what if everybody around you had died? How big the circle would be? That puts the number on a human scale that I think that makes it much more understandable for a normal human brain like mine. And that the reactions to the project actually reflect that. When you take a look at the reactions of Brazilians in social media, the reaction is invariably, wow, I never imagined that this problem was so huge. And this is the power of this project.
To make this project come true, we invited three very creative young professionals. the designer Vinicius Suero, the data journalist Rodrigo Menegar, and the developer Thiago Maranhão. And in around 2 months, more specifically in July 24th, with the precious help of Alberto Cairo and Marco Túlio Pires from Google News Lab Brazil, we launched at the Epicentro.
Hi everyone, I am Rodrigo, one of the developers that Gilberto had just mentioned. From now on, I'll be the one that will explain the nerdier parts of the project, since I'll be talking mostly about the design and development decisions we made along the way. I'll be the one talking about these technical aspects, but before I move on, I need to acknowledge that this was a huge collaboration effort between a lot of people, and I would like to thank Vinicius Suero and Thiago Maranhão, two of my friends that collaborated with this technical part, putting the code and the design and the layout up. And I can't even describe how important they were and how much credit they deserve. In order to make this presentation feel more dynamic, I'll be walking you through the narrative. I will show you the project so you can see for yourselves how things look like, and I'll be stopping and making some comments about the decisions we made and why things are looking the way they are, so you can get a better grasp of what we were thinking at each step of the of building this whole special story. So without further ado, let's move on to this. So let's start our walkthrough. In this first screen, we simply expect the user to input his address. I'll be doing so by entering the address of my old house in São Paulo, where I used to live before the pandemic hit. And I think it's a good example because it's one of the most densely populated areas of the country. So what we are showing here is a place I know very well. I know, for instance, that this is an avenue where I used to take the bus every day to go to work. This is where a good friend of mine lives. Over there we have like a really big train station. So I know this place. And this sense of familiarity is very important for what we are trying to do here, and you'll see why soon enough. Each little gray dot here represents a person, one of my neighbors. We use Brazilian census tract data to put one dot for every person that lived inside this block, so you're seeing a really good approximation of the amount of people who live in this block, for instance. And here, in this next screen, one of these gray dots turns white. Why did it turn white? Because we are pretending that the first death that happened due to COVID-19 in Brazil actually happened in my neighborhood. This is not true, this is only a simulation, this is the whole concept of the project, simulation, that all deaths happen around me. But we want the user to really understand that this is a simulation, that this isn't real, so we repeat this encoding in the next step, showing around 50 white points. By this moment, I really want the user to understand what's going on here, that every little gray dot that you can barely see from here now, but they are there, they are your neighbors that are still alive, and this white dot, when the dot turns white, it means that someone died due to COVID-19 in your simulation. And in this next step, you understand why the sense of familiarity that I just talked about is so important. This is the first wow moment of the narrative when we zoom out and show this circle. This circle contains 133,000 white dots. That is, everyone that lived inside this radius would have died if COVID-19 happened only in my neighborhood. And I really understand that. I know, from here to here, this is probably from Santa Cecilia to the end of Barra Funda. I know these places. I walk through these streets every day, so now I can get a real good sense of the scale of these deaths, which I didn't have before. And since this is a very emotional moment, we also allow the user to share his map. So he can click here, he can save an image, which will take a while to load, but eventually will be there, and share it as he sees fit. And by now, I really hope to have grabbed the user attention. That's the whole reason I'm going in this very individualistic narrative to say, okay, this is what COVID looks like around you, so I can move on from this near view, from this very particular individual view, into a more big picture approach, and then we move on to the next step, in which we show Caieiras, which is a city nearby São Paulo, in which if COVID-19 again happened, if all the deaths happened inside Caieiras, the whole city would have gone. They would all be dead. And independently on where you are, if I was in Rio de Janeiro or Curitiba or whatever other city, in this step we would always show the city closest to the user that would have vanished. Again, in order to have this sense of familiarity and making the whole scale of the event understandable. Then we move on again, and we keep saying, you know, the dots in Caetas, you give the user an idea of the actual distribution of population, of how many people are there, and then we move on to a next step. We are going in this narrative arc from the very individual, from the very micro level, going to a macro level, and now we are in a nearby huge metropolitan area. We are seeing Rio de Janeiro because Rio de Janeiro is close to São Paulo, but if the user was everywhere else, he would see the capital of his state, for instance. And then we move on to a place that's widely recognizable. This is the Maracanã Stadium. You probably have heard about it. This is the biggest soccer stadium in Brazil, and this is a cultural reference that is probably understandable to all Brazilians. All Brazilians know that a lot of people live in this area, and again, we are moving from this very individual point of view to a broader one, while still keeping the same encoding and the same visual ideas that we had on the beginning. And finally, we move on to this final step in which we show the actual distribution of deaths in the country. We are having I was going to say that it was taking a while to load, but it was decent enough. And now finally, we show the actual distribution of deaths in the country. Each dot represents a city, and the bigger the dot is, the bigger the circle is, the more people have died there. And then finally we go back to the beginning of the story, go back to the user neighborhood, we show again the place where I live, and by going full circle, we try to make the whole scale of the pandemic more understandable. We calculate the circle. This is very important to mention, methodologically speaking, by calculating the intersection between each census tract in Brazil, again census data, and the radius of the circle. So this is an approximation, but it's very consistent. Then we finish the story with the option of, again, producing the picture and sharing it and saving it and sharing it as you see fit. From a technical point of view, all of this was built with Python in the back end and Mapbox in the front end. We wrote a whole article about it. It's on Medium, but sadly it's only in Portuguese. You will see the link on the screen. You can visit. But if you don't read Portuguese, I will be glad to answer any questions you may have in the chat. Thank you.
The feedback and response we had from the epicentro were amazing. The project was published on Friday, as I said, July 24th, and a week after launch, it had more than 210,000 accesses. Of these, 178,000 were single users. These people spent on average 10 minutes and 54 seconds browsing the site. For every 100 people who saw "Você está aqui," which means "you are here" in English, and is the first step of this journey, 71 reached the end of the narrative. Regarding the form of access, 85% of people access it using a mobile device, a cell phone. The project was featured in cable TV network CNN Brazil.
A agência Lupa, que faz a checagem de material publicado principalmente na internet, criou uma plataforma que dá a dimensão das mortes causadas pelo novo coronavírus aqui no Brasil. A gente vai mostrar essa plataforma aqui no nosso telão. Olha só. Então, é como se tivesse aqui, a gente estivesse aqui nesse pontinho, e aí esse pontinho fosse um pontinho de uma pessoa que teve coronavírus e morreu. Aí depois, então, depois de tanto tempo... De uma semana depois, 46 pessoas já teriam morrido perto dessa outra pessoa que foi contaminada pelas outras. Depois de 130 dias após a confirmação da primeira morte, o número total de óbitos causados pelo novo coronavírus chega a 83.121 em todo o país. Então, é uma demonstração de como que a doença vai se alastrando, né? Da dimensão da doença.
And also in Global TV, our biggest open TV network here in Brazil, at an electronic magazine called Fantástico, during Sunday primetime television slot.
100 mil é o quê? Qual o tamanho desse número? Eu vou acessar um aplicativo que dá uma ideia disso. A partir do ponto onde eu estou, aqui no bairro do Maracanã, na zona norte do Rio, a ferramenta abre um círculo mostrando a área ocupada pelas 100 mil pessoas que, neste momento, estão mais próximas de mim.
The reactions among ordinary people were also everything we could wish. The reactions was expressed on sentences like these ones we randomly collected on Twitter on the weeks after launching. And we have the prints, by the way. But for example, they said, this is sad, shocking, desperate. What the beep in the case, it is as if my entire neighborhood has died, that of my son's school, that of my work, that of the school that I studied, of the college that I attended. It is brutal. And also, I imagine myself going out and seeing the deserted streets, houses, buildings, schools, everything deserted, abandoned, dark. Well, immediately after the launching and the impact of the project, we started to receive a series of contacts regarding the possibility of the model being replicated in other countries, since it is open source, of course.
This idea is universal. I mean, the way to represent this data at a human scale, I think that it is translatable to any other country. You just need to sort of like use a similar code that was used in the original tool, and then have access to detailed census data. If you have those, and then you need to have developers in the team, obviously, who can implement the code. But if you have all these components in place, if you have all these elements in place, translating this idea to your own environment should not be hard.
Okay, guys, that was our journey at the epicenter. And to finish, I'll let you with a quote from Henry D. Hubbard from last century. He said, "There is a magic in graphs. The profile of a curve reveals in a flash a whole situation. The life story of an epidemic, a panic, or an era of prosperity. The curve informs the mind, awakens the imagination, convinces." Thank you.